I'm Alex Pacheco, founder of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. In 1981, I ran my finger down a list of animal laboratories in Maryland, where I live, and found the laboratory closest to my home. It was called the Institute for Behavioral Research, IBR. The next day, I applied for a job there, and although I'd never worked in a laboratory before, I found myself working there within the week. And within 6 days, I was put in charge of 2 different experiments on the animals. IBR was 9 miles from the U.S. Capitol and less than 3 miles from the headquarters of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. NIH is the single largest financer of animal experimentation in the world. And when I walked into IBR, NIH had already spent over $1.2 million tax dollars on the set of experiments that I was assigned to work on. The chief experimenter was a psychologist by the name of Edward Taub. Taub had conducted experiments on primates for 20 years when the photographs you are about to see were taken. This is a macaque monkey in a head restraint device made of steel. Here you see the effects of self-mutilation. This monkey is missing a number of his fingers, and you can note the hairless patches of scar tissue at the wrists. Most of the monkeys in these pictures have had 1 or more arms or legs surgically impaired by an operation called deafferentation, in which the nerves at the spine are severed, rendering 1 or more limbs useless. Through the use of electric shock, food deprivation, sight deprivation, and other negative stimuli, the primates are forced to regain the use of their crippled limbs. Even though attempts to confirm any tangible evidence of benefit to humans or to other animals have failed, the experimenter in this laboratory, Edward Taub, claims this research is useful for stroke victims and the mentally retarded. This is Chester, one of the most neurotic of the monkeys. His left leg has been deafferented. This is a conditioning chamber, a converted refrigerator with a plexiglass restraining device inside of it. The monkey is put inside this soundproof and lightproof chamber. An electrode is taped to his left ear or to either hand or foot. The monkey will then be given electric shocks which will continue until he uses his crippled arm. This monkey is on what is called a choke rod. His arms and legs have been shaved for the electrodes. Here, the monkey is being taken into the chamber. Most of the equipment is homemade and never goes through any safety testing. This accounts for additional injuries to the animals. This chamber has blood splattered on both walls and the ceiling. This is Paul. You can see 2 large open wounds on his left arm. These wounds were never treated. Here is Paul about a month later. One morning, I found that none of the animals had been fed for 3 days. 2 monkeys, named Paul and Hard Times, had collapsed to their cage floors. The experimenters poked their fingers at Hard Times and found he couldn't move. They gave him a bowl of juice, but his head fell into the bowl. I stood with Hard Times for 20 minutes, supporting his head to keep him from drowning in the juice as he attempted to drink. Paul had torn off all 5 fingers on one hand. His palm was shredded, and 3 bones could be seen sticking out of his palm. His hand had been reduced to a bloody stump. Another researcher dragged Paul from his cage, and without bothering to wash or clean the mutilated hand, simply sprinkled a mild antibiotic powder on it, applied 3 gauze pads, and taped it up. This slide shows Paul about a week after the incident. The bandage stayed on for about 3 weeks and was never changed. This is a close-up of what's left of Paul's hand. You can see his fingers, missing at the palm, protruding from the rotting bandage. This is Paul with another open wound above his bandage. This wound was also never treated. Some of the broken wires in his cage are visible here. Here is Paul approximately 1 month later. His hand is swollen at least twice its normal size. Note that his upper arm is heavily scarred from previous injuries, and tooth marks can be seen clearly. Also notice that this cage is less than 18 inches wide. All of the monkeys except Sarah were taken from the wild almost 5 years before these photographs were taken. They had spent every day since then in cages 17.5 inches wide and 36 inches deep. These highly intelligent and social animals are confined to barren cages which contain absolutely nothing, not even a resting board or anything to touch or manipulate. This is Paul again, still with open, draining wounds on his hand and wrist. This picture was taken a few days before the police raided the laboratory. The police executed a search and seizure warrant on the laboratory based on evidence that I had gathered over the 4 months that I worked there. Here is Sarah, the only female in the colony. She is also the only rhesus monkey. All of the other monkeys are male crab-eating macaques. When Sarah was 1 day old, she was purchased from another laboratory, Lytton Bionetics, and she was confined to this cage for the last 8 years. You're looking at a typical cage with wires sticking up from the floor through an accumulation of excrement. Even though this laboratory received over $100,000 a year in federal grant money for this experiment, the cages were never cleaned or even wiped off in the entire 4 months that I worked there. You can note the dried vomit on the outside of the cage. Here is a pile of feces in another cage. You can see mold growing on it. This is the colony room floor. The excrement to the left of the cage wheel is also covered with mold. The dark stains in the front are from urine. These conditions were accepted by all the doctors and researchers employed at the Institute for Behavioral Research. This is Experimentation Room A. The jury-rigged equipment you see is used for delivering electric shock. The peeling wallpaper is a violation of the Animal Welfare Act, but like all other violations of the Act, it was overlooked by federal inspectors, who are veterinarians from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is an excrement tray. It's used to collect feces and urine beneath the cages. The large yellowish objects are food pellets. Since the monkeys were not given food dishes, when the food was thrown into the cages, it would fall through the wire floors. Normally, the pellets are smaller and darker, but here they are swollen with urine. At the most, the animals were fed once a day, although on several occasions when caretakers didn't show up for work, the animals had to go for 2 or 3 days without food. Here, 2 monkeys are reaching into their excrement trays in an attempt to extract contaminated food pellets to eat. Monkeys will not ordinarily eat food that has been contaminated by feces. This is Billy in cage 16. Billy is bilaterally diaphragmated, meaning he has had both arms surgically impaired. Billy is the gentlest of the monkeys, and the researchers call him Billy the Bilat. Because he can't use either of his arms, Billy has to try desperately to quickly eat the food pellets from his cage floor before they fall into the excrement tray. To add to his problems, Billy has lost 8 of his 10 fingers. This is Billy's right hand. Even his single remaining finger is missing in part. This is Billy's left hand. When he becomes tired of bending over to eat from the floor, he has to eat with his feet. Here, Billy is holding my hand with his foot. He's the most timid of the monkeys and would hold on to my hand for as long as I could stay with him. Here, a partially restrained monkey is being used in a dexterity test. He has been deprived of food for 2 days prior to the test. The experimenters call this fasting. The monkey is trying to pick pieces of food out of the holes in the dexterity board with his crippled hand. He's missing his left arm because of unchecked self-mutilation. This is the only medication refrigerator in the facility. The freezer section is completely frozen over, and medication is strewn across the bottom. Many bottles are stuck in medicine that spilled and gelled to the floor. The black area in the paper bag is a mass of rotted apples. These apples were occasionally fed to the monkeys in some experiments as rewards. All of the medication had expired, some of it 2 years before I started working at IBR, and many medications had expired as far back as 12 years before I started working there. The dark objects on this ledge are rodent droppings and urine stains. The information on this clipboard had not been updated for over 2 years. This is the only freezer in the facility. You can see that 4 shelves are completely frozen over, and the bottom shelf has a plastic bag containing a monkey named Herbie. Behind Herbie is Caligula. Caligula was destroyed because he mutilated into his chest cavity and had gangrene from a bandage that was never changed. During the execution of the search and seizure warrant, police discovered 2 large barrels of dead monkeys in the food storage room. The bodies were floating, along with car parts and pieces of lumber, in barrels that contained deteriorated formaldehyde. Bits of arms and legs were exposed to the air, and some of the dead monkeys still had bandages on their arms, indicating that they had not been necropsied to determine the causes of their deaths. This is the operating room sink. It remained in this condition for the entire 4 months I worked at IBR. The pipe to the left is for runoff water from an air conditioner in an adjoining room. It's difficult to show the cockroach infestation and the amount of filth in the sink area. This is the operating table, seen here doubling as a desk. To the foreground is a restraining device called a stereotaxic device. It's used to immobilize the head of an animal. The monkey's arms would be fastened to the large bars, and the smaller metal bars, seen horizontally, are used to fasten onto the animal's skull. Here, a monkey is about to have nerves severed at his spine. He is lying face down with his wrists taped to the large metal bars, and his head and neck have been shaved. This is a variation of the same experiment. Only here, a monkey fetus is being exteriorized. Nerves will be cut at the spine, or complete vertebrae will be cut from the spine. The fetus will then be returned to the uterus and later removed by cesarean section. Earlier experiments in this laboratory involved taking 1-day-old monkeys, sewing their eyes shut, and then crippling both of their arms. This fetus has had some vertebrae removed and a prosthesis, a piece of plastic, has been placed over the missing vertebrae. This monkey is undergoing a Prism Test. A heavy set of prisms have been placed over his eyes, completely inverting his field of vision. Now, experimenters will see how well he can use his crippled arm to feed himself and defend himself from attacks while his field of view is inverted. This monkey is being put through a sight deprivation test. His head is completely taped up for weeks or even months at a time. You can note his scarred wrists and missing fingers. Other experiments involve tying down the animal's good arm and then throwing the animal against a wire wall, with the animal having to use his crippled arm in order to prevent himself from falling to the floor. Here, a monkey has been thrown onto a cage wall, forcing him to cling with his good arm. He must now use his crippled arm to defend himself from a metal pole that is repeatedly thrust at him by the research psychologist, or else get hit with the pole, or else fall to the floor. This is Augustus, one of the 2 monkeys I was given for a displacement experiment. Less than 1 week after I had been in the laboratory, I was put in charge of conducting a pilot study. I was given an experimentation room, 2 monkeys, and videotaping equipment to record this original research. These are the 2 monkeys that were assigned to me, Augustus and Haydn. Whenever I rolled their cages together, Haydn and Augustus would make desperate attempts to touch and groom one another. For this experiment, I was told to frustrate and torment the monkeys and then videotape their reactions. The capture nets, like the one in the background, were used with sheer force and violence to remove the monkeys from their cages. The often blood-stained nets would be slammed over the animals, and the monkey then dragged to the cage floor and then out onto the main floor. The monkeys were frequently injured while being netted. In the process, the monkeys' elbows, knees, tails, toes, and fingers would get caught in the wire as they were dragged over the bottom of the cages. This is Adidas. He is one of the 5 control monkeys who had not been operated on. The next 4 pictures of the monkey Domitian were taken over a period of 3 months. Here he is shown with an untreated injury with exposed muscle tissue. Domitian's tail was completely hairless. Normally, you couldn't even see the skin on the tail because a healthy tail would be completely covered with fur. This is a closer shot of the open wound on Domitian's arm. Domitian was given a bandage only once. It was applied by the only caretaker in the laboratory, a person who had no veterinary or animal care training. Often, Domitian's arm would be swollen almost twice its normal size. Here, Domitian's bandage is deteriorating, and he has started to self-mutilate into his arm. 2 days later, you can see that the wound and the hole in the bandage are much larger than before. Now, after a few more days, you can see Domitian has a new open wound. He was then placed in a restraining device and prepared for a Hemostat Test, a test designed to inflict acute noxious stimuli. Domitian was tested with a pair of hemostats, which are surgical pliers or pinchers that can be latched shut. Acute noxious stimuli, in lay terms, means acute pain. The hemostats are used to clamp onto the skin of the animal's neck, arms, back, and chest, by closing the surgical pliers to the third most painful notch to test the animal's reactions to pain. Before hemostats were used, the standard acute noxious stimuli test in this laboratory used to be carried out by applying an open flame to the skin of the animal. In lay terms, an open flame is another word for a cigarette lighter. This is the restraining device that Big Boy was in when he almost died by hanging. I heard Big Boy screaming and found him hanging by his neck as the homemade immobilizing seat had collapsed from beneath him. Here you can see that the neck bar has been put into place. Many of the animals choke continuously when they are immobilized in this way because the neck bar presses so hard against their throat. This is Domitian several days after his acute noxious stimuli test. This time his wound has been caused not by self-mutilation, but by improper bandaging. His hands and legs are still bound with the tape from the test. Because of the severe psychological deprivation that these animals are forced to endure, the deprived monkeys pick at their own flesh, making their injuries even worse. This is Dr. Taub's desk. For decoration, he displays a monkey's skull and a monkey's hand. The small white object in the hand is a monkey's tooth that has been jammed between the fingers. This is another immobilizing device in which a monkey may be left for months on end without ever being released. Here, Dr. Taub is using a dexterity board with a partially restrained primate. This is the severed hand Dr. Taub uses as a paperweight. By the time I'd been at IBR for 4 months, I had gathered enough evidence to take the case to the police. Armed with hundreds of photographs as well as affidavits from scientists that I'd taken into the laboratory, the police removed the monkeys from the laboratory under a historic search and seizure warrant. Dr. Taub was arrested and charged with cruelty to animals. Although IBR's animal laboratory was closed as a result of this investigation, today these monkeys are still alive and still fighting for their lives.